I reached out to the Nationals. It wasn't Mike Rizzo. I was talking to one of their assistant GMs, and I expressed interest. Who wouldn't express interest in Scherzer? And it was pretty quickly shut down. And basically, Max had full control over where he would go, and the team has some control over where he would go. And so basically what I was told was, we made a list of the handful of teams we want to send them to. And I'm sure their list isn't just based on like who's in their division, but it's probably based on likely return, who's got a deeper farm system to be able to get us the players we want to get. So they made a list of where they'd prefer to send him. He made a list of where he'd prefer to go. And I was told we weren't on either of those lists. So I don't think we need to talk about him. Which, I appreciated the clarity, and it was something that I just crossed off the list and moved on. You just heard me talking about the conversations I had leading into the 2021 trade deadline with the Washington Nationals about pitcher Max Scherzer. They sure made it clear that wasn't happening. We'll get into my thinking behind trades we did make during the 2021 season, philosophies regarding hitting and pitching coaches, and the truth behind how my time with the Mets ended.
Champions aren't born, they're built. This is Deconstructing Champions, a podcast that explores the art and science of winning to help you elevate your game in sports, business, and life. And now, your host, four-time World Series champion and founder of Four Ring Sports Solutions, Zack Scott.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the show. Today we continue my retrospective on the 10 months I spent with the Mets, this time covering the start of the 2021 season through my dismissal as GM. Once again, Jonathan Van Halen joined me to ask the tough questions. Besides being a diehard Mets fan, he's a Brooklyn-based stand-up comedian currently writing for The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Today we discuss the adversity faced by the 2021 Mets, that year's draft, controversial hand signals on the bases, and more.
All right, Zach, let's talk about the 2021 Mets season. Mets fans will remember the year started off with 3 postponements because of COVID issues against the Nationals. So I'm curious, what was your process of trying to get the team vaccination rate up to a sustainable amount? Were players spearheading it? Were players apprehensive to do it? And did you perceive it as a competitive advantage to have a higher vaccination rate, which the Mets obviously did not have?
The way I approached the vaccination situation with the players was to focus on it as, obviously it was a health issue, but I really tried to focus on talking to them about it as a competitiveness issue. So, we didn't want to lose games because players missed time due to COVID. Getting vaccinated was our best chance to make sure we kept players on the field, because once you got it, it could spread around, and all of a sudden you're losing lots of talent on your field. And if you have too many people that obviously, like the Nationals, they just postpone it, and then you'd have double headers or whatnot. But yeah, to me, that was the focus was, guys, this can't be the reason why we don't make the postseason. It wasn't the reason, but we also didn't have a very high vaccination rate. I want to say we were one of the lower teams. I don't remember the number. I just remember we had a lot of leaders on the team that were, for whatever reason, opposed to getting vaccinated. And so it just made it a little hard to get everyone on board. Again, we were fortunate that it didn't cause major problems for us, but it was disappointing because if you recall, they incentivized players by, you got to a certain level, I want to say 80%, then you didn't have to wear masks, or there was some reason to not have to deal with some of those hassles that could motivate players. But we didn't get there. We didn't really come close, which was disappointing. I remember when we were out in San Francisco playing the Giants, they were the highest vaccinated team. And I remember asking people at the Giants, how'd you get almost everybody? They may have even had everybody. It was like upper 90s, if not everybody. And they said, well, Buster Posey spoke to the team and basically said, you're doing this because for the same reason that I mentioned, right? Like, we're not losing games because of this. So we're all getting vaccinated. We owe it to each other to do that. And Buster was a great leader that everyone respected, so they followed through on that. And I'm not saying it as a criticism to our guys. We just didn't have that dynamic in the clubhouse. It seemed to correlate with, what part of the country you were from, whether you wanted to get vaccinated or not. It was what it was.
And so you don't think that the 2021 Mets lost any games because of the low vaccination status? There was a ton of doubleheaders because of the rain as well as the COVID postponements. I think at some points the Mets were playing 38 games in 35 days, crazy stats like that.
We had a lot of doubleheaders that year. I think most of them were because of weather. At home, the way it works is you have kind of this control room where you're watching a bunch of monitors, you're talking to multiple weather people, and I felt like I spent way too much time in those discussions because there was just so much rain. But I don't believe we lost many games to our players being sick. We lost a series to the Nationals having COVID in their clubhouse. It was 7-inning double headers, but it was a lot. I do remember that being a major point of frustration, especially when we start having health issues and some of the pitchers we were running out there were just not ideal for sure.
On the eve of the season, the last day of the offseason, you executed along with the rest of the team Francisco Lindor's contract, 10 years, $341 million. He did not start off strong in 2021. So I'm curious, did you have any buyer's remorse, or was this just, Mets fans saw with Carlos Beltran, it takes players a bit of an adjustment period when they come to the New York Mets on a large contract. That being said, fans are not really patient when this sort of thing happens. So I'm curious what was going through your head. Was Lindor, you knew he'd be the guy that you thought he was, or did you think, oh no, in 2020 he had a sub 800 OPS. Is that who he is now? And is he now a really highly paid defensive first player?
I didn't really worry about the slow start. His first 2 months were pretty rough. He ended up bouncing back and having June, July, August. He didn't play a whole lot because he was hurt, but June, July, and then September were strong months for him. Yeah, I didn't worry about it. I honestly didn't. Bill James, when I worked with him at the Red Sox, he once referred to this as a transition tax. When you would sign a contract with another team, there was this measurable adjustment period that you'd see players go through, and we definitely experienced some of that in Boston, and I kind of thought that might be the case, what was going on with Lindor. And yeah, like you said, fans are impatient in general. There was high expectations for him and for some others, and even though we were playing fairly well early in the season, the Boo Birds came out early, and for multiple players, they get paid a lot of money. They can deal with that. There's no upside in really doing that either from the fans' perspective, but it's interesting seeing what just happened with Lindor getting a standing ovation. They are human beings. They do feel these things, and there's only upside with support and only downside when you're being critical of them. But they get paid the big bucks. They can handle it. So I wasn't worried about it. I didn't have concerns about 2020. Again, the underlying numbers were indicative of a better performance than his OPS. So it was just about him getting comfortable and not putting too much pressure on himself, which is a fairly common thing if you start out slowly and you have a big contract. They want to win. He wanted to win badly. He wanted to perform badly. And sometimes it can be this compounding thing that you're putting too much pressure on yourself. But he came out of it, and it didn't surprise me. You keep giving the guy an opportunity, keep believing in him, and he's ultimately going to be who he is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what didn't help is that early on in the season, there was a bit of a controversy between him and Jeff McNeil where they got into a tiff in the dugout, said that they were talking about whether or not they saw a rat or raccoon. Mets fans know this well. Luis Rojas did not comment on it. With 3 years of perspective, what can you tell us about the situation? What happened? The rumor was that McNeil was not playing in position. He wasn't playing where the analytics told him to play, and that's what he and Lindor were fighting about.
So that had definitely come up a couple times. I remember being on the road in Chicago with the team. We were playing the Cubs, and there were actually 2 plays where the positioning called for McNeil to play up the middle, and he played a little closer to normal second base position. And he beat us, hit a single up the middle. And I know there was some frustration there on that. And then he came up again and the same exact thing happened. And so we got beat by two singles up the middle where there should have been a defender standing there. And so I remember after the game, there was some frustration there from some people, and it was addressed. My sense was it was part of some tension between multiple people and Jeff. And then I don't know what exactly happened that night. When I spoke about it publicly, obviously I dismissed their story. I mean, hey, they want to have fun with it. That's fine. I felt like doing that made it a bigger deal than it needed to be. I think players get heated. It happens all the time. It's not a big deal. It doesn't mean, these two guys can't coexist. It doesn't mean they hate each other. Guys are passionate. Guys want to win. It's a competitive thing. And so, on the one hand, it was interesting to me because if you recall, Lindor in spring training was talking about how he doesn't like shifts and things like that. He was saying it very publicly, stating that, or had at least done that when he was with Cleveland. And he was fully on board with what we were doing. And Gary DiSarcina, our infield coach who did the positioning, he was, fully on board. We had a good thing going in that area that existed before I arrived. I think it was better just because more time had passed and there had been better collaboration between DSAR and the analytics group that was presenting it. The information was presented in a better way. The information was passing more of a smell test. So there was good momentum in using those tools that definitely are provable and work. And Lindor was bought into it, which is great. You want a guy that's under the contract that indicates he's clearly the face of the franchise and your shortstop to be on board with that. At some point, Louis just said to Jeff, you gotta get on board too. Like this, we're doing this for a reason. It's not just to bother you. It's because we think it'll help us win games. And ultimately, Jeff got on board and was following those things closely the rest of the way.
Nice. Well, I want to ask you about one of the first big personnel decisions that you made in season was letting Chili Davis go. What went into that decision? What were you not seeing from the offense? What's the process of letting your hitting coach go in terms of how you communicate that to the players, how you communicate that to the manager? And just for our all the listeners' reference, you did not hire Chili Davis, you inherited Chili Davis, correct?
Correct. Well, one thing that I want to be clear on, I'm not a big believer in decisions based on results in a short period of time. It's more what is going on under the hood. What's the process behind the scenes? I'm in a new position. I'm in a new organization. I'm trying to build relationships with the manager and his staff. We get a great opportunity to do that in spring training. And then, the season starts. And I think I went on half the road trips and then split the other half between two assistant GMs. But I tried to go on a lot of road trips, especially early on. I was going on the road trips to build those relationships and to see how people prepared, how our players prepared, how our coaches prepared. And yeah, there's some judgment there, but it's really in the interest of helping, right? How can we be the best version of ourselves as coaches, as front office people, as players? And so, yeah, I'd sit in on meetings just to observe. I liked a lot of what I saw with the pitchers and what was going on there with Jeremy Hefner and company. On the hitting side, I wasn't completely thrilled with the preparation. I think it's just a different style. It was more about, and again, I knew Chili from Red Sox days, so wanting to see if anything had changed or if he kind of went with his same process, which is fine if he does. It doesn't mean that he's wrong. It just might be a different approach that I don't agree with and think we should do things differently. So with Chili, it was I felt like a lot more informal, which I think he felt was good for building relationships with players and not wanting to put too much information in their heads, which I completely agree with. I just felt like there was a happy medium there. I view a big league coach, especially with veteran players. With young players, it's a little different, but with veteran players, which we had quite a few of those, your job is to course correct, right? They are really good players. That's why they're at the major league level. But They have ups and downs throughout the season. They sometimes fall out of their mechanics. They sometimes are just making bad decisions, or they don't have an approach when they're going up to the plate, or they're just lost. When a player is struggling, how do we handle this internally with the staff? I just wanted more from that process than what I was seeing.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think we were taking into account all the different possibilities. There's a mental component to it, which is important, and I think Chile did a good job with that piece of it, just trying to keep guys relaxed and not overly focused on what they're doing wrong and keep it positive. The goal is to get guys out of their slump faster, right? If there's something that you see that's not who they are, they've got enough course with their mechanics. I didn't think that we had the ability to identify that fast enough in-house. And so, ultimately that was the decision. I think the toughest part of that decision was the timing. My initial thought was we're going to go through this season and then we'll make decisions on the staff. Didn't want to move too quickly on that. Obviously, I knew Chile from before, so I had more information. I didn't feel like, and this is not meant to be any kind of offense to Hugh Quattlebaum or Kevin Howard, who ended up being in interim positions. I didn't feel like we had an in-house solution that I felt great about for the short term. I also liked the roles that we had hired those guys for. We hired Hugh to be the director of hitting development. We hired Kevin to be the director of player development. So I felt like we're taking away from an area that's really important, player development, and putting two guys in the clubhouse, one who had no experience in a major league clubhouse in Kevin, and the other one with Hugh, he had experience with the Mariners in a major league clubhouse because one of their hitting coaches had opted out during 2020. So he was one of the big league hitting coaches in 2020. So that's why I made him the lead. I felt like, well, he's been there to some degree, albeit in a unique set of circumstances. I was straight with Hugh from the start that this is purely interim. We're going to reassess. Now, if he had obviously gone up and done like an amazing job, then he would have had a really good shot at staying in that role. But I wasn't going into it thinking that. Like, he would have had to really do something extraordinary for me to feel like that's what his role was going to be. And I was straight with him from the beginning. Like, I want you to focus and do the best job you can, but just assume you're going back to the role you're in at the end of the year. At a minimum, we're going to have a robust process to actually find the next hitting coach. It could be you. I think it's fair to have that person be considered for that job, but it wasn't a job I was handing him, and he understood that. I was fully transparent with that. So, yeah, as far as how it works, the kind of communication portion of it, I definitely botched a big chunk of it. So my plan was, we were in St. Louis. I wasn't with the team, but I flew out to join the team because you got to do these things in person. You owe that to someone working hard for you. So I flew out to join the team. I had talked to Louis already, and it was hard for him. I mean, it's rare that a coach or manager is feeling like, oh, these guys can't do the job. I mean, that's his staff, and they tend to be somewhat defensive of their staff, and I like that. I think that's good. Like, this is their team; they should be good teammates as well. So he definitely pushed back on it through multiple conversations that we had. So the game ends, call Chile in, and then Slate in and tell them that we're moving on. Usually when people hear that news, they don't want to talk a whole lot. I gave a fairly high-level reason, but I didn't go into a lot of detail because no one's typically listening when you do that. I said, I owe it to you to give you a full explanation when you're ready for that. If you're ready for that now, then we can have that conversation. And they weren't ready for that then, which I totally understand. And so it was, all right, we'll pick up this conversation at some point that when they're comfortable to do that. Plan was to then have a quick team meeting to tell the players this was the decision that was made. And I was scheduling a meeting. We had reserved a ballroom at the hotel for the next morning, where my plan was, hey, we just had a game. It's late. I'm going to tell you what happened because we're going to announce it publicly, and I want you to hear it from me first. And then tomorrow morning in the hotel, I want to meet there so you can have the freedom to ask any questions you want, vent frustration, My belief is you just be very open about it, get it out there, and let's move forward, because it's not going to change what just happened. If there are people that are upset about it, let's just air the grievances, right? And let's talk about it. And I have no problem doing that. So that was the plan. Unfortunately, half the team had already gone to the buses to go back to the hotel. I meant to have had the traveling director of travel put a note up on the whiteboard there to say, stay for a team meeting. Didn't have them do that. And so I thought the timing would be okay, but you'd be surprised how fast some of these guys can shower, change, and get on a bus to get back to the hotel. So, in hindsight, I should have probably had them come back, or I should have gone to the buses and talked to the players on the bus and talked to the players in the clubhouse separately. The press release went out, and I wish I didn't let that go out, but it did, because it's just kind of the nature of how these things work. So there's like this feeling of rushing to get the word out, because someone's going to find out, right? We want them to find out from the team. We don't want them to find out from the person that got fired or from a player. Unfortunately, that goes out before all the players can be told. And Pete Alonso comes rushing in from the cafeteria, and he's pissed and kind of gets in my face. He's a big guy, much bigger than me, and which is fine. I appreciated Pete's passion. I just said to him, "Hey, Pete, let's, this isn't an open area. All the players are around, kind of looking like, whoa, what's going on here?" And I just said, "Hey, let's step aside and just have a conversation." And we had a good conversation. I felt like by the end of it, he understood where I was coming from, even though he disagreed. He understood and appreciated that I was willing to be so open and honest with him. And he kind of calmed down from that initial reaction. I think he was pissed because he found out on Twitter, which I totally understand. That was my fault. Next day, we have that meeting in the hotel. It was funny because Pete was pretty hot still. And I thought like he'd have a night to sleep on it. He would not be as fired up, but he was still pretty pissed off. And he pulled up a seat right in front of me while I addressed the room. And he asked me a lot of questions, and some other guys asked questions, and it was fine. I mean, I just told everybody, I had the whole support staff. It wasn't just the players. It was, the chef and the clubhouse guys, and, everyone that travels with the team. Like, they're all part of this group. You're all kind of like a family when you're traveling that much. So I thought I owed it to them, though, why one of their family members was no longer there. And so I explained it. And I think most people were appreciative of just the opportunity to ask questions or hear me out. I had some veteran players actually apologize for Pete, which I said, you don't need to apologize for him. I appreciate the passion that he's showing. I appreciate that he cares. He cares about his teammate. Chili was his teammate. So I think overall, I definitely could have done that better, handled that better. And it was something I learned from. But, you learn from your mistakes and you move on.
Yeah. Well, I guess then I have a quick question on the flip side, which is Jeremy Hefner. He's survived like 4 different regimes. He's been around with the team through a handful of different managers. From your experience, what makes him valuable? Why does he keep getting brought on? Why is everyone like Hef so much? Seems great, but I mean, just from your personal interaction with him and how he interacts with your players.
He's very thoughtful. He's obviously been there in the big leagues, so he's got that credibility. He listens well. He injects the right amount of the analytical information in a way that's effective in my mind. And he's just an easy guy to talk to. So he's a good relationship builder in that sense. He's a little on the quieter side than a lot of coaches, a little more introverted than I think your typical coach. But there's just a lot of substance there and good content. And I can't speak for players, but my sense was that players know he cares about them, which is always important, and that he wants them to be the best versions of themselves. And so I think there's just a lot of respect and there's a lot of substance. And, he's a likable person to be around because he's, he listens and can deliver a message in a way that is custom to that person he's talking to, rather than some people are kind of cookie cutter. This is the way we're going to do it. And it's a one size fits all approach. He's not like that.
So if, say, something happened and he were not with the Mets anymore, you think he'd get another job within a heartbeat? Do you think it's around the league that he's this? Does he have a reputation? And because of that, do the Mets have to pay him more than the market rate for a pitching coach to make sure he does stick around?
I think he got a contract extension after I left. He would definitely get a job anywhere pretty quickly. whether that's a pitching coach or like a director of pitching development or director of pitching, one of these roles that have kind of popped up in the last 5 years. He and I actually talked about possibly him doing a role like that at the Mets. We had a lot of conversations on the road about things like that. Not everyone wants to live the travel life of coaching for
Yeah.
too long, but they probably do have to pay him quite a bit. I definitely think he'd be in demand. I've had multiple teams call me since I left the Mets to ask me about him.
Well, then back to what was on the field. The Mets started off, they had a decent start to the season. Certainly, they were in first place for a long time. That was more so because the division was pretty weak for quite a bit of it. But around May, injuries just decimated the team. On your 25-man roster, at a certain point, you had Cameron Maybin, Billy McKinney, you had McCann playing first. What happened, and how did that influence the way you thought about roster construction and roster management when you looked around and, some of those lineups that the team ran out were not pretty?
Yeah, I mean, it was tough. I mean, one of the things before the season that was important was trying to improve our depth should there be injuries. So Jonathan VR was a player that we brought in for that. Pilar was a player that we brought in. Almora was, we brought in a bunch of guys. Not all of them ended up performing, but that
Mm-hmm.
was the idea, right? Is that if we have injuries, which we're going to have some, that you have your depth can be two things. It can be the veteran bench player. I feel like most managers want the guy who's been a bench player that's just going to be happy with his role and not complain and want more playing time. Those guys are great, except when you need them to play every day. And if they can't do it for whatever reason, then that's a challenge. So you're always trying to find guys that you don't mind playing every day, or you always would rather have your starter, but you think that they're decent enough that they could play every day. And then there's the bench guys that are more just purely role players, contributors on a limited basis. So, I think VR ended up having a good season that year, and he got a lot more playing time than we anticipated. Pilar was, up and down a little bit, but he's kind of what you'd expect from him. And then he obviously had that awful injury where he got hit in the face
Yeah.
with the pitch. But he was he's such a tough guy. We had him in Boston too. And he inspired some people by just the way he handled that and came back from it. Yeah, it was tough. I mean, Billy McKinney was very good for us in that time. We had Khalil Lee coming up and really struggling offensively, and guys that, like Fargus, like certain guys, I don't even know if I had heard of some of these guys before the season started. It was like, gosh, I can't believe we've gone so deep already. It was almost embarrassing for me because I'm calling around trying to make trades in May. Like, it's not usually what
Mm-hmm.
GMs are looking to do. I mean, I was expressing interest in a lot of different players to say, hey, like, we're just decimated by injuries. So, I'm open to talking if you are. And, most people aren't because they're still trying to figure out what they have, which I understand, but that's my job. I had to do that. We ended up doing a trade with the Brewers for Billy McKinney. Picked up some players like Maben, like you mentioned, who really struggled. Great clubhouse guy, but just really struggled at the plate. So, yeah, that was tough. It's great when those guys contribute. We won some games, and it was, it's inspiring because they're, overperforming at times. But it's tough. As far as the injuries go, we had a lot of different kinds of injuries. So we had more soft tissue injuries. So, soft tissue injuries can drive you crazy because in theory they're preventable. So there's always kind of a deep dive into why certain injuries happen. You want to understand, is there something that we weren't doing to prevent these, or was there something that could have been done better? And then there's the post injury. How do we treat the guy to get him back? So we had quite a few soft tissue injuries, but then we also had, some fluky things like the Pilar one I mentioned. I feel like at least another player that went for a diving play and hurt himself. And it just seemed like it was one thing after another. And, on the season, I remember seeing someone tweet out that we had the most WAR lost to injury, or expected WAR, I guess, projected WAR lost to injury. It felt that way, that's for sure.
Well, I want to ask about someone who did get injured but also produced a lot of WAR. Jacob deGrom ended up pitching 96 innings in 2021, put up 146 strikeouts. His ERA was 1.09, something around there. what was it like from your perspective in the GM seat watching this incredible performance? I mean, had he pitched a
Yeah.
full season, it would have been beyond legendary. Who knows if he would have been able to sustain such a low ERA? Law of averages would say no. But what was it like interacting with deGrom? What was it like watching this season? And did you have any contract extension talks with him during the year? Or did you kind of have a sense that he was playing until his opt out and then, you know, he was not interested in a contract extension? He wanted to see his free market value.
I'll address the contract extension first because the only conversation I ever had with his agent about that was in spring training before. I think it was one of those things where it's like, hey, we'll put something out there that, no team is probably doing. We still had a couple of years of control before his opt out before the season. And I think they knew that, hey, if they say yes to this, great. If not, that's fine. We move on. And so it wasn't much of there was not back and forth. It was pretty clear that they presented, here's what we'd be willing to do, which usually doesn't happen. So I appreciated that, where they made it easy to say, hey, I don't think it makes sense given that we have 2 years of control and his age, and just kind of there's a lot more value in kind of waiting it out to see what happens. So, that wasn't really an issue. As far as watching him, so it was my 18th season, I believe, in baseball, and you always feel good when you watch a player perform, and it's like you're watching baseball for the first time. Like, it's just, I was giddy. I was like I was a kid every time I'd watch this guy pitch. I didn't show that. I was very professional, but even I remember in spring training, his first live BP. On the one hand, I was like, that's the most impressive live BP I've ever seen. On the other hand, I was like, why is he throwing 98 miles an hour in his first live BP? Like, worried about that. Like, I've seen some guys do that, but with him, it's just, he's so important to the team that I feel like it's natural to feel very protective of, making sure he stays healthy. Yeah, every time he pitched, it was unbelievable. It was an event, really, just to see what he could do. The other dynamic that year, though, because he was holding your breath, because he walked off the mound multiple times. Now, most of those injuries that, when we reported them as such, were not related to pitching. There was a time where he hurt himself swinging the bat. If you remember, he actually hit well that year.
Of course.
For a time, he was one of our best players, probably during that May stretch. But he's a ridiculous athlete. Like, you see him like shagging fly balls in the outfield, and he looks like he could play center field. He hurt himself swinging a bat. I believe he hurt himself like chunking a shot on the golf course on an off day or something. But just these things where he felt something. It wasn't like a major injury, but he felt something. And then, what I appreciate about him, and probably some people get frustrated with him about, is that he is very sensitive to knowing when something's not quite right. And so in those instances, when he's pitching after those things happened, and he felt like something wasn't right, in some cases it's like this guy's dominating through 3 innings, through 5 innings, and then he's got to come out of the game, and he's asking out of the game because something doesn't feel right. Fans especially get frustrated when a guy pulls himself out of the game. I don't, because you want him to be healthy. I'd rather him do that than be a tough guy and, I'm going to gut it out, and then he's going to miss, more important chunks of the season. Unfortunately, he ended up missing a big chunk of the season anyway. So right at the trade deadline, he had more discomfort. And at that point, it's like we've had 3 or 4 times where there's something that he's feeling in his, forearm or something somewhere else that's not, and it's not showing up as being something to be concerned about. So you just didn't know, like, okay, is this that again, or is this going to be something more significant? And really, as we found out, like, really late on the day of the trade deadline, that he's going to miss a significant amount of time. In my mind, I felt like he's probably going to miss the rest of the season, but that was just me probably being doomsday about it. But that's what ended up happening. It wasn't necessarily what I was being told. And the reason you're not told that is because people don't know. I mean, it's just, you got to see how guys respond once they, you shut a guy down, then he starts throwing again, and then you learn a lot more when he starts throwing again, and setbacks can happen, and there's just so much that can happen. I just kind of assumed, like, the likelihood is that there's some sort of setback at some point, and he doesn't come back this year. And then, the way the team was playing, why would he come back anyway towards the end of the year? And I was gone by then, but it made sense how they handled him. But that was tough. That was tough news because I felt like he's our ticket, right? Like even if we get to the postseason without Jake, like it's going to be hard to do anything in the postseason without him because you really need to, ride that guy to the championship based on how our team was structured, which is not how you want it to be structured, but that's kind of that was our reality. Jake is a very unique person. I should say a very unique personality for a superstar. I've been around Pedro Martinez, Kurt Schilling, Josh Beckett, John Lester, like really, ace type pitchers. They're usually extremely confident, and Jake's confident, but he's really like, if you have a conversation with him, there's a humility about him, or just even a discomfort at times. And I get it. Like I'm more introverted than extroverted, so I get it. And I'm just used to like more bravado from from your ace, and that's okay. It just was different. I'd never really experienced someone that elite that wasn't also like showing that in their personality. And so it was fascinating to see that, and I liked seeing that.
Real quick, I'm just curious. Would you rather have peak Pedro or peak deGrom?
I'm going to say Pedro. I'm biased because I was a Red Sox fan. His best year is 99, 2000, because it was the height of the steroid era. And he pitched his home games in a bandbox at Fenway Park. What he did in 99 and 2000 was just unbelievable. And so I think in that context of such a high offense era, for him to do what he did, it just, I'd have to say Pedro.
Wow. And what's the...
I like both.
What's a contract you would have been comfortable giving deGrom? Let's say, you were negotiating with him going into his free agency at age 34, though he didn't have a crazy amount of miles on his arm. What annual average would you give him, and how many years do you think you would have been comfortable with? And
yeah, I mean,
he ended up getting 187.
I was looking at it, which obviously wouldn't have got it done given what he got from the Rangers. I was looking at it more like kind of what ultimately Scherzer, Verlander types got. They're older, but also had been probably injured less. But that's kind of how I was looking at it. And maybe it's like 3 guaranteed rather than 2 plus an option type of thing, like I think those guys had. But similar AAV. That's how I was thinking of it, as like a shorter high AAV type of deal. But good for him. Good for him on what he got. It's impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of Scherzer, let's talk real quick about the 2021 trade deadline. The Mets came into the deadline in first place, not a commanding lead by any point. You knew that deGrom was going to miss significant time. Scherzer was on the trade market with Trey Turner. In the media, it was reported that there was going to be a, quote, division tax for the Mets to try to get Scherzer. Can you tell me what happened when you spoke to Mike Rizzo about Scherzer possibility, and how seriously did you pursue that trade?
I reached out to the Nationals. It wasn't Mike Rizzo. I was talking to one of their assistant GMs, and I expressed interest. I mean, who wouldn't express interest in Scherzer? And it was pretty quickly shut down. And basically, Max had full control over where he would go. And the team has some control over where he would go. And so basically what I was told was, we made a list of the handful of teams we want to send them to. And I'm sure their list isn't just based on like who's in their division, but it's probably based on likely return, who's got a deeper farm system to be able to get us the players we want to get. So they made a list of where they'd prefer to send him. He made a list of where he'd prefer to go, and I was told we weren't on either of those lists. So I don't think we need to talk about him. Which, I appreciated the clarity, and it was something that I just crossed off the list and moved on.
So you pivoted, and the starting pitcher that you acquired was Rich Hill. How did you end up there? You also got Trevor Williams, who was kind of a flex. He was going back and forth between the bullpen and starting. Tell me about how those trades went down. I guess first Rich Hill, and then we'll circle back to Trevor Williams and Javy Baez.
Rich Hill, I want to say we acquired him about a week before the trade deadline.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was just like we needed arms. We were It felt like kind of how we were with position players in May. It was like, we got to get some arms. I knew Rich from Boston days. Obviously he was up there in age, but he'd been having a pretty good season with the Rays at that point. We actually tried to sign him in the offseason before, moved on after reviewing the medical information, which then when we traded for him, which was a quick trade, the Rays were pretty clear on what they were looking for, and that was a really fast trade that came together quickly. And his dollars weren't going to like push us over a luxury tax or anything like that, so that one was pretty easy. We knew we were getting a guy that could maybe give us 5 innings each time out there. He's going to compete with what he had left. Still had the good curveball, but it was at this point, I used to joke that he's a wiffle ball pitcher, but he was crafty. When we acquired him, I got a call from his agent saying, better talk to Rich because I think he's pretty pissed at you. And I was so confused. And he said, from the off season when you were interested in signing him, but then you guys looked at the medical and you weren't interested in signing him. So I reached out, and he reached out to Rich, and he was pissed, but we had a good conversation. Again, it's fine if a guy's going to be mad about something. Like, let's just talk through it, because obviously, I can share what my perspective was, and he can share how he felt about it, and then we can move on. And that's what happened. I ended up having some very good conversations with Rich in the clubhouse, so there was no lingering problem there. But I'll say this about players. It's something I admire and respect about them. They're so competitive. I don't think people realize this. They're so competitive. When they are injured or have been injured, they're very sensitive about that. There was a time in my career, and we don't even do this practice anymore, I don't believe in baseball, but you used to have to, anytime you did a transaction, you needed the player to sign a piece of paper acknowledging he's being sent to the minors or called up or put on back then, the disabled list. And I always hated when I had to get a player to sign the DL one, because I knew they were going to be pissed, not because they didn't think they should go on the DL. They were just pissed that they had to, that they were injured, that they couldn't contribute to their team, and that they're, whatever is going on with them, if they feel like they're just letting themselves down, they're letting someone else down, they're just always in a bad mood. And so it'd be like, oh man, I got to go down and get this guy to sign this. Like, he's going to bite my head off, kill the messenger type of thing, which would happen quite a bit. I was happy to pass that along to someone else down the road. But I respected that, though, because it was coming from a place where you want to see, like, you want these guys to be like mad that they're not contributing. That conversation with Rich was an interesting one. And I think it was another one, kind of like the one I mentioned with Pete, where like it started heated, and I think by the end of it, even if he disagreed, he understood my perspective, and we were able to move forward because of that.
So here's a question. You're replacing Jacob deGrom's innings with Rich Hill. It's not a commanding lead that you have in first place. You have a roster that's definitely still banged up at this point. Yet you go ahead and you execute the trade for Javy Baez and Trevor Williams, giving up the Mets' former first-round pick, Pete Crow-Armstrong. So I have a few questions. One, do you think he must have thought that the Mets had a shot at the division, or Steve Cohen in his first year just really wanted to at least go for it? And then two, I have to assume, but is it just much easier trading someone else's first-round draft pick? It's like, well, Brody Van Wagenen chose this guy. Pete might be great, but like, I did not. This is not my choice, because Brody traded away Jared Kelnick. It's like, when you're trading away a first round, and not just first round, but like top 10 draft pick, do you think that it's easier when it's from a previous regime? And did that make you more willing to, go for it? Package with Steve Cohen probably also wanting to play this a little more aggressively.
My perspective on it was, we had a 4-game lead at the deadline, and it's not huge, but it's significant. Didn't know yet what Jake's situation was. So at the time, I'm not thinking that we don't have Jake deGrom. Was talking about bigger things with the Cubs. The Cubs had a lot of players that they were moving. If you recall, they made a bunch of trades. And so I thought there were some multiple pieces that fit, and, but at the same time, like, the Cubs controlled everything, right? They're the ones holding the pieces that people want. They could play this game where they get what they want from multiple teams, and I think they did a really good job at that deadline. So with us, the thing with Pete Crow-Armstrong was, it had nothing to do with that it was Brody's pick or anything like that. My bias was from how we saw him in Boston in the draft. So I thought there was a lot of fourth outfielder risk with him. Loved the defense. The unknown was the bat. And I think the Mets amateur was much higher on the bat than Red Sox amateur. So I was influenced by what my thought was about him from going through that draft with the Red Sox. He was ranked our fifth highest prospect according to MLB Pipeline at the time. Now he's, the number one prospect of the Cubs, like top 15 or 12 or something like that in all of baseball, according to that same MLB Pipeline. So he wasn't regarded as even one of our top prospects. And I'd say his value, industry value, reflected that. I talked to a lot of teams. It's my style to throw out a lot of different ideas and ask about a lot of different players just to see if there's a trade or a fit. And he certainly wasn't one of the top guys that people were asking about. So what I see this is, obviously in hindsight, that's a bad long-term decision. I'm happy that we got a player that performed very well. It didn't matter, obviously, and he became a free agent. Baez did everything he could. Some people will tell me, it doesn't matter what you give up, you got to focus on what you get. I disagree with that. I think it does both matter. I'm glad he came and was arguably the best position player traded. Rich Hill performed like one of the better guys that was acquired at the deadline, given his innings limitations. So the guys we got played well. Williams ended up playing well, and especially the following year pitched really well. So the big league players produced. But in terms of value, if you look at Pete Crow-Armstrong just purely as an asset, obviously we sold lower than his peak value. But I give the player a ton of credit for that. He was also injured at the time. He injured his shoulder sliding. I wasn't too concerned about that. But it's another reason why obviously his value is not going to be too high. He hadn't had much playing time to perform. He had performed in a small amount of playing time. Kid has great makeup, great defense, can run. It's just, it all came down to what you believed in with the bat. Now you could argue, well, he's such a good defender that he's going to get opportunities because he's got that survival skill of contributing. Even when he's struggling at the plate, he's going to get chances because he can help you in the field, which is very true. I thought his upside was a possible everyday guy, almost like a Jackie Bradley type, except a little bit, more speed. And I thought less power than what he showed. If I'm going to compare it to Red Sox players, I saw him more as Jackie Bradley and not so much Mookie Betts. So I felt like, okay, that's still a good player that I wouldn't have traded Jackie Bradley for a rental. But I thought with Pete, like part of my bias was that he, I thought he might be a fourth outfielder. I thought there was a risk of that. And I thought the upside was that he was that everyday guy. So the kid goes out and continues to perform, and he's since, by my estimate, tripled his industry value since that trade, which is unbelievable for him. That doesn't happen a lot. In fact, a lot of guys go the other way. I just tip my hat to him and say that, that's great for him long term. Objectively wasn't a good decision for the Mets. I didn't feel great about it. Like, there weren't a lot of people in the room that were jumping up and down to do that trade. So to answer your question, it was pretty clear to me that we were acquiring an impact player. Mm-hmm. So part of my thinking was, I got to do the best trade I can without, really crushing our farm system and getting a player that we like. And I felt like we accomplished that, and it seems like I chose the wrong guy. Because, of course, of all the prospects that we had, he now has the highest industry value, I would guess. And so I didn't see that happening, and our job is to get it right more often than we get it wrong. I got that one wrong.
But what about Steve? How does Steve factor in all this? What sort of guidance he give you ahead of the trade deadline?
Steve is deferring to, baseball ops on, what we want to do. He wasn't in the deadline room. I'd check in with him. We'd have conversations. But like I said, it was pretty clear organizationally that just acquiring Rich Hill wasn't going to cut it. That's not going to be our headline move. Sorry, Rich.
Yeah.
So, there was that. And then it becomes, okay, well, who do we think are impact players and who's actually available to us? There was a lot of Chris Bryant talk out there. It was clear that the Cubs saw somewhere else as a better fit. When I'd ask about him, they wouldn't even engage, which is totally fine. Probably not the right place for him to come to. I thought that was the best player, and I think he was the best player that we could have acquired.
Before we stop talking about the trade deadline, just one thing: the Braves really rebuilt their roster at the trade deadline. Ended up overtaking the Mets. You had told me that in part before that this is because of they had a little more money to play with because of their attendance. Can you expand on that?
One of the frustrating things about that season, COVID season number 2, was not being allowed to have fans, but that not being universal across the board. And I know there were teams that thought that it would be unfair if other teams, states, handled it differently and allowed them to have crowds. That would bias typically in favor of warmer weather places, right? And also different political environments. We felt like we're in New York, we're never going to get, or Boston felt the same way. Like we're not going to get that benefit. And that's, real money if you can get people. So I believe it was written that the Braves talked about that was the reason they were able to do some of these deals where they took on salary and didn't have to give up as much in prospect because of that. So that was frustrating to see them benefit from that. Not that it would have changed things for us, but it was just frustrating to see them kind of get all these players and then all those guys perform well. I mean, I know from being with Boston and New York, like being in a position to take on the most money at the deadline is a huge advantage. Something we voiced at the beginning of the season as being a potential unfair advantage as we talk through all these protocols and to see it actually happen was just, again, it wouldn't have changed our outcome, but it still seemed unfair for other teams that were competing with them.
The next thing I wanted to talk about is that your job isn't only to take care of the Mets of the present, but also of the future. And so you got to be the pioneer of 1 year of drafting for the Mets, and the labors of it are blooming pretty nicely. You drafted Christian Scott, Dom Hamill, Mike Bassel. What do you think now, seeing these guys pop off on the Mets system? It seems as if this pitching lab has really helped them have some great put-away pitches, and just very curious what your thoughts of that, especially because you didn't really get a first-round draft pick. Kumar Rocker did not sign.
We drafted a lot of pitchers, a lot of arms. It wasn't that we went into it thinking we're going to draft a lot of arms. We just felt like that's where things kind of fell, and we were excited about it. If you can produce your own pitching, like to me, that's a huge, huge advantage because relying on the free agent market for pitching is just so high risk. I mean, free agent market's risky anyway. Mm-hmm. You're relying on pitching. They're obviously in their 30s when they're free agents typically, and you're just buying the danger years most of the time if you're doing big multi-year deals. If you want to do short deals and buy lows and things like that, like that's usually a good idea. Ideally, you're producing that talent that either allows you to trade for controllable pitchers or those are your guys that you can bring through the system. So yeah, no, it's been great to see some of those guys do so well, especially, I know Christian Scott, to see him doing so well is great. What I like about him is that he just pounds his zone. He's got good stuff, but he also, there's a lot of guys today that have good stuff, but they're a little all over the place, and he does both. So that's pretty exciting. And a lot of those other guys that you mentioned, I mean, there's some good arms there. The value of getting your internal pitchers to do well is huge. So hopefully they get at least a couple, 2-3 guys to come out of there and be contributors, whether that's in the rotation, the bullpen, whatever it may be. But yeah, it's been good to see that, especially like you said, we didn't end up signing Kumar, and that was tough. They ended up using that pick a year later on Parada, who's kind of been a little up and down so far. But I liked that pick. I wasn't there at the time, but I really liked the pick. I thought that was the right guy to pick at that time.
Where's Kumar at right now? He ended up having surgery.
Yeah, he ended up having Tommy John, which is weird. I got like some messages from people saying, "Oh, you guys were right about him," and it's like, no, it's Tommy John. Like Jake deGrom had Tommy John in the minors.
Yeah.
That doesn't make it right. And I hope that he goes on to have a great long career and pitches really well. When he was pitching before he got hurt, he looked outstanding for them. They'd made some good tweaks to what he was doing, and it was really showing in the stuff. So hopefully he comes back, rehabs, and comes back from that and is set up to have success long term. That's who I felt bad for the most in that situation, was the player. I'm glad he ended up getting quite a bit, almost the same amount of money that he was going to get from us. Glad he's with a good organization in Texas, because that's just tough. Like, we didn't want that. He didn't want that. It was just tough all around. The way the system's set up, if there's a lot of medical concern, and you might be wrong about that, you may be right about that. These things are hard to predict, but if there's a lot of medical concern and the fact that the team gets a draft pick the next year, it's kind of set up for the team to have more of the advantage than the player, which isn't great.
Yeah, it is.
But that was the reality that we had to navigate.
Heading back to in the season, after the trade deadline, one of the first big storylines coming out of it was Lindor and Baez thumbs downing the fans. That's what we call an unforced error. What did you think when you saw that happening? I'm sure you did not like that your big marquee player was brought into it as well. And what was your conversation like with Baez and Lindor afterwards, saying, guys, you can't do that?
It's funny because these guys today make all sorts of hand signals on the bases. So I don't know if you remember, earlier that year, they were doing the OK sign for Lucchese's churve pitch that he called.
Yep, the
changeup curve is churve. Yeah, and so I'd see them running around the bases like this, and that signal has some other contexts that are pretty
alt-right,
negative,
white nationalist or something.
Yeah, something like that. It's so I actually, for the first time ever, was like, I need to find out why they're doing that and make them aware that it could be misinterpreted. Because I knew that wasn't why they were doing it, but I just wanted to, I need to have a conversation. So we had that conversation, and I think they kept doing it, because I was like, you got to make it publicly known that this is what you're doing. So, the first time in my life I ever have a conversation about hand signals on the bases, and then months later, we're in the situation where Lindor gets a double and he's looking at the dugout, putting his thumb down, and I had no idea that it was about the fans. Because these guys just come up with crazy stuff all the time, and I don't really pay attention to it, because I never would think that a player would do that, quite honestly. So to find out it was when I think it was that he talked to the media about it. They asked him about it, and he said what it was, or is that how it came out? I don't even remember.
Yep, exactly how.
Yeah. And then, Baez is kind of supporting his teammate and buddy doing the same thing, and which is, again, like, bad choice. Steve was not happy about it. A lot of people were on. I wasn't happy about it. Louis wasn't happy about it. First, the conversation is, did anyone know that this is what was going on? Because if so, that's a huge problem that we knew and didn't stop it. No, no one in a leadership position knew. No one thinks that that's what they'd be doing, because it's a bad look. You just kind of assume it's just some inside joke. So that was tough. I did not talk to Lindor about it because Louis did, and Lindor handled it well, for what I recall, and nipped it in the bud right away, or at least tried to. It's hard to do that. My recollection of Baez is that he was basically like, I was just supporting my teammate, and so I don't feel the need to apologize, type of thing. And so, which wasn't great. Actually, one of the last things I did before I went on leave from the Mets was talk him into apologizing, getting him to see that was not a smart choice, and doesn't matter what his intentions are. I feel like I've said this to a lot of people that I've worked with. Intentions don't matter. It's how it lands. And so this is how it landed. So you need to address that. Whether it was your intention or not doesn't matter. And he ended up doing that and apologizing for it, taking ownership.
Yeah. And it sounded like the Mets were, somewhat serious about contract discussions with him before the 2022 season. Thank goodness it didn't work out, but it seems as if it didn't, necessarily tank his relationship with some of the folks in the front office. And, he ended up having a nice little post-trade deadline run, put up like a 880 OPS, and that heals all wounds, does it not?
Yeah, no, he ended up performing well and came up big in some games. And so I didn't think that caused any kind of damage. And in fact, I think my sense was that a lot of people in the organization were really happy in the end with his performance. And he's one of those players that when he's good, he's really exciting. He's kind of electric, right? I think he does everything well: defense, base running, power. Obviously, the approach has never been a positive one, but when he's clicking, it looks really good. His baseball IQ is really high. It didn't surprise me to hear like Mets people were really excited about him because they got to see a good version of him. And, Detroit's unfortunately seeing the other side of that. I felt like he would have been a high risk player. If I was there, we wouldn't have signed him because we wouldn't have gone to that level. And I think that's ultimately what happened with the Mets too.
At the end of August, you were put on a leave of absence because you were arrested under suspicion of a DUI. I was curious what you have to think now, reflecting 3 years later on how it was all reported on. And then did you think that you would come back? Because it ended up being that you were no longer the general manager after the end of the season. They decided to go in another direction. How did it all play out from your perspective?
First, I'll start with taking accountability for things I did do wrong. I made multiple mistakes. I'd say the 3 key mistakes are: number 1, to get behind the wheel with any amount of alcohol is something that shouldn't be done. And I never denied that I had some alcohol. That came out in court, and I told the police that as well. So that was something that I shouldn't have done. Number 2, I put myself in the wrong place at the wrong time by going out way too late to go find food was actually what I was doing, but I shouldn't have been out that late. It was like 4:30 in the morning when I got arrested. And then the third thing was that I didn't immediately call Sandy and tell him what happened. So this happened late. I don't get home till 5:30 a.m., 6 a.m. So instead I send a note to someone and give me a name of a lawyer. When it becomes a more reasonable time, my wife suggested that I get in touch with Sandy. I had talked to the lawyer by then. He called me right away. And I said, hey, this is obviously going to come out at some point. I should probably talk to the Mets. And he said, just, given the circumstances, something seemed off about it to him. So he said, I just want to make a couple calls before you talk to anyone. So just sit tight. I was anxious about that because I figured it might come out. I regret listening to him, and I actually ended up firing him. But I'm not saying it was his fault. I should have listened to my wife and just reached out to Sandy right away and just been totally transparent with what happened. I was scared. I had never had any issue with the law in my life. I knew the truth of what had happened, and I knew what was going to be reported was not going to be the truth of what had happened. So I wish I just did that, because I think that was the thing that probably bothered them the most, is that I wasn't, upfront about everything. And I think I part of it was I took some bad advice, but that's on me. That's not on the lawyer. That's on me to do that. So those are the things that I regret. The problem I had with how it was reported, and it doesn't surprise me, I was once watching a show. I want to say it was like a John Oliver show, or there's something once they did a story on how police report things. Basically, they said when you read something that says police report, almost ignore what comes after that. It was very eye-opening to go through this process, because we have a system set up. If anyone's under any kind of legal scrutiny or criminal charges, every lawyer tells them to not talk about it, right? Just keep quiet. We'll let the legal process play out. There's only downside to talking about it. So everyone clams up. Well, the police don't. They speak on it immediately, and they're going to present it in a way that makes it look like a slam dunk. But it's not always reporting things accurately. So in that particular situation, it was reported that I was passed out at the wheel and that I was intoxicated, which I would say I was neither passed out at the wheel or intoxicated. And, I'm not going to relitigate my whole case, but it was very satisfying when I eventually got acquitted, which wasn't until early January of 22, but more so than getting acquitted, which people realize how rare it is to get acquitted of this kind of charge. Not only driving while intoxicated, but the lesser charge of driving with ability impaired. If you've had any amount of alcohol to drink, you could be found guilty of that if there was evidence to suggest it affected your ability to operate a vehicle. So all the evidence was body cam footage from the police. So everything's caught on camera for the judge to review. And getting acquitted felt good, but more so what the judge said. And he's like, I usually don't explain my decisions, but given these circumstances, there's a couple Mets beat writers in the courtroom. He felt the need to actually explain it. And so his explanation was, one, he said, I was clearly not intoxicated, and he believed I was not even impaired because of the way I performed on a field sobriety test. And two, I'm not passed out at the wheel. I'm looking down at my phone. I'm alert right when they knock on the window. It's all on video. So to me, knowing the truth, knowing that the video would show that, it was really hard to wait because I knew the truth, but I can't really say anything. I just got to wear it, So with the Mets, I basically said they put me on leave, which I totally understand in light of what had happened with Jared and Mickey Callaway. There was just a lot of bad timing and things that were making them look bad. So I was contributing to that from their perspective, which I get. What people worry about in that, especially after the Jared situation, is there's something going on. Like, why is he out at 4 a.m? Like all these, there's something else nefarious going on. I don't know what people are thinking, but I could see that being the logic. I would have been fine if the video leaked. You see all these videos leak all the time of people getting pulled over. And it's like, other than not wanting there to be a video out of me for my children to see of me getting handcuffed, I almost wanted it to be leaked because I was clearly not intoxicated. And so the judge also said he challenged everyone in the courtroom to perform a field sobriety test right now better than I did in that video. And he said, I guarantee you won't be able to do it. That stuff felt good because it was so shocking to me and my attorney that it went to a hearing, went to a trial. Felt like it was a newer DA that was trying to make a point. They knew it was not that it was high profile, but there was some media coverage of it. And, I think she ran on a tough on drinking and driving thing. And so I get it. It wasn't a good use of anyone's time to take that to a trial because they weren't going to win based on, there's an actual video showing how things went down. But it is interesting because police take the stand and they tell a completely different story than what's in the video. And the judge would call them out, which was great because he's like, I just watched the video. That didn't happen. This was what happened. So that was vindicating. But I just had to be quiet about it and move on. So I'm on leave from the moment that day where it came out that I was arrested to when they fired me in early November. This was reported by The Athletic that they were going toward the end of October, going to bring me back in some capacity. And that was true. And I had some conversations about coming back as the general manager, which is ultimately the direction that we were going in, and which was reported in this article as well. But then the article, this was an article written by Tim Britton and with contributions from Ken Rosenthal and I believe another writer. And they called me about it before they wrote the letter and said, we have this story about how your lawyers, you had a meeting with your lawyers and Mets lawyers and it got really contentious and you were mad about how they were handling it. It was this completely fabricated story that I don't know where it came from. Tim Britton had called me just to get a comment from me on it. And I said, Tim, this meeting never happened. You can talk to my lawyer. I've known Tim for a long time because he was a beat writer at the Red Sox. And he said, well, we have two sources saying that it did. And I said, I don't know what to tell you other than you're putting out an agenda for your two sources. So I just want you to know that. Like, you put out whatever you're going to put out, but I'm just telling you, like, that meeting never happened. So it goes out. I think they tweaked it a little bit, so it seemed a little softer, but it still talks about this meeting where I showed a lack of accountability, and this meeting that just never happened. In fact, then it gets picked up by sports radio, and my attorney calls me because he hears them talking about it on sports radio. And he's like, "What are they talking about this meeting? We never had this meeting." No, there was a meeting that we talked about having with lawyers, but we didn't have it because something happened in between that, and they ended up firing me without really giving me a reason. So, 4 hours earlier, I think I'm coming back as the general manager, and then I get a call saying I've been terminated, and I don't get an explanation as to why. A lot of that was reported in that article, and then this article came out after I was terminated and talked about this meeting that never happened, and that was kind of the last straw and why I was let go. So I really don't know what happened. I wish they waited till the court part played out, but I also understand that it kept getting pushed back, and it ended up on January 6th that I got a verdict, and it's a long time to wait. I mean, it probably shouldn't have gone to trial, but it did. So that was a story. And, on the one hand, it was a lot of waiting, a lot of being in limbo, and that was challenging. But in the end, like, even though it ended with me being terminated, it was just nice for that to be over and I could move forward and, think about what was next for me after that. Cause it's the uncertainty that's the difficult part.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you've been able to, have some success and stay in the game with your consulting. And I appreciate you answering all these questions about the 2021 Mets.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Deconstructing Champions. I hope you enjoyed hearing my perspective on the ups and downs of the 2021 Mets season. We faced many challenges related to health, weather, and far too many controversies. I spent only 10 months with the Mets, but it was an incredible learning experience that made me a better leader, mentor, husband, and father. My time as GM certainly didn't have an ideal beginning or end, but I'm forever grateful to the Mets for giving me that opportunity. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the podcast, please share it with friends and colleagues. You can find me on all social media platforms at Zack Scott Sports. That's Zack with a CK. If you work for a pro sports team and want to be empowered to win through data-informed decisions and elite front office talent, check out 4ringsports.com. That's FOUR, ringsports.com. Thanks again to our guest host, Jonathan Van Halem, for his time, good questions, and passion for the Mets. Check out jonathanvanhalem.com to find out where you can catch his stand-up. Please join me next time.